Are we ready to start?
Yes, Sebastian.
Well, welcome everyone to this, already August session, and we have a very exciting program today with Professor John Behr, who has the marvelous title of Professor of Humanity in the University of Aberdeen. And he's going to be in dialogue with Father Andrew Louth on a work of Gregory of Nyssa that he's been editing, studying, and this work is on the human image of God. So I think he will introduce the subject, and then a discussion will take place, and I think anyone can join in, really. Okay. So over to you, John.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. Thank you, everybody, for coming this afternoon. This book came out recently. I spent a number of years editing it, preparing a critical edition translation, but actually I've been working on it for some 30 years or so. My doctoral work was on asceticism and anthropology in Irenaeus and Clement. Father Andrew was my examiner, along with Rowan. And the question of what it is to be human is really the one which perennially fascinates me. How that ties together with Christian theology, Christology, all the different dimensions of anthropology, and so on. And the work of Gregory is really one of the most fascinating works from the early church on this topic, on what it is to be human, what it is to be male and female. I wrote my first article, I think, on that very topic as a rereading of this text some 30 years ago. I've never really been satisfied with the standard interpretations of this work, which typically work along the lines of Gregory holds to a double creation, prelapsarian, postlapsarian. Prelapsarian, we were neither male nor female. This is activated in the fall. It characterizes a postlapsarian existence, exemplified in the garments or skin, and a whole way of interpreting Gregory that way. But Gregory doesn't talk like that in his work. So there's something more going on in this work. Having worked on Origen, having worked on other people backwards and forwards, I decided it was finally time to turn to this work, do an edition, do a new translation, and prepare an introduction for it. It's the only major work of Gregory which is yet to be edited for the GNO series, the Jaeger series with Brill, so it doesn't have another modern edition. The last edition was by George Forbes back in 1850. Working through it, very slowly, working through the manuscripts, working through the text, looking at the textual tradition, looking at the placement of the chapter headings, looking at the Syriac manuscripts with all of that and so on. And then preparing myself to write the introduction for it, where I realized that in order to introduce it properly, I'd have to go back to Anaxagoras and his reflections, so far as we can determine it, then obviously to Plato and the Timaeus, to Philo, to Origen as background for Gregory. In doing that, I was really struck by various turns of argument that Gregory makes in this work and the way they parallel the Timaeus. And then working through that further, I became convinced that what Gregory is in fact doing is modeling his work on the Timaeus. And we know that Gregory is able to do that. He did the dialogue on the soul and resurrection, a deathbed dialogue with his sister Macrina, clearly patterned upon the deathbed dialogue of Socrates. So, he's capable of consciously reworking these classic Platonic texts, giving a new content to the forms that he's working with, which is really quite unique. I don't know of any other writer really before or after him that has that creative freedom to do that, which is probably worth reflecting on further. But with regard to the Timaeus, there are really three parts of the Timaeus discourse, as Timaeus recounts the beginning of creation culminating in a human being. In the first part, he goes through and talks about how the demiurge creates the world by looking at the most beautiful model, and then exemplifies all of that as an outpouring. But then he stops himself about halfway through the discourse and says, well, actually, so far, I've given an account of what has been crafted by intellect, by nous. But he says, I've got to match that by providing a comparable account concerning that which has come to be by necessity. He says, this ordered world is of mixed birth, offspring of union of necessity and intellect, with intellect prevailing over necessity by persuading it towards that which is best. So the first part is, if you like, the ideal view of creation. The second part is intellect persuading necessity, and whatever he means by necessity, but it's worth reflecting on. And then he gets to the end of the work, and then he says, having done both of these, we now have to put together both of these accounts under a single head. And then he goes on for the last quarter or third of his work to provide an account of the human being full of anatomical, physiological, and medical details of drawing upon Hippocrates and whoever else to describe the actual conception, physical structure of the human being and so on. Cornford makes a comment in his commentary that a lot of the Timaeus is pretty hard reading, and these final pages are almost indigestible. You know, people generally do not read them. Okay, so with that kind of three-part structure in mind, it really seems like Gregory's doing the same thing. He's not talking about prelapsarian Adam followed by postlapsarian Adam, what happens with the fall and so on. In the first 15 chapters of the work, he speaks about, well, he starts off by saying, I'm going to complete what my brother Basil didn't complete in his Hexameron. I'm going to turn to the actual human being, the construction of the human being. He starts by talking about how the world has been prepared as a banquet, ready for someone to be introduced to enjoy the banquet, to know God through creation. And then he gives a really positive description of the human being as the culmination of creation, as the culmination, as he puts it, of the ascent that nature makes by steps from the lower form of life to the higher. He regards Moses in Genesis 1 as describing a philosophy of the soul, from the vegetative soul to the animal soul to the human soul. Yeah? So the progression of nature through these different steps, but not simply as a culmination of that, because the human being is distinct in that it possesses intellect, nous, and he's very specific that nous is not simply the latest developmental stage of soul, but rather, he even says it's not given by God, but is given to, the human being is given a share of it in God. So it's participation in God through the nous. He gives a very positive description of the relationship between body and soul, the way the body is constructed to befit a rational being with fingers so that we can speak rather than have mouths that are formed for eating grass. He talks about how it is only through the body and its senses that our mind learns, and that in fact we become rational through this. If it weren't for the body and its senses, he says, our mind would be incommunicable and isolated. The body is an instrument through which it plays, through which it communicates, through which it learns. And so it's through the body and its weakness, he says, that we learn to become rational. So a whole beautiful description of the human being like that. In the midst of that, he diverts at a couple of points. He's got an extended chapter, chapter 12 and 13, where he talks about laughter and sleep, points at which, you know, our mind is relaxed and we seem not to be in control. And in the midst of that, he talks about the genesis of evil. And the genesis of evil, he says, occurs when we no longer look towards the good, but rather look towards matter. As long as we're looking towards the good, as long as we're looking towards God, our mind is beautified by that vision, and our mind acts like a mirror on our body, so our body becomes also beautified through that vision. On the other hand, if we turn our attention towards the body, well, matter in itself is formless, and our minds will become as formless as our body, as matter itself. So a kind of epistrophe that's going on in that. But that's really tucked away really tucked away amidst a long discussion about laughter and all sorts of other things where we seem to be relaxed. He's kind of padding it away in a hidden manner. Then he gets to chapter 16, and he says, okay, we must take up the text again. Just like Timaeus says, we must begin again. We must begin again from the starting point. Gregory says we must begin again. Let's take up the text again, he says. God created a human being in his image, after his likeness. And then he says, well, look around you. Where do you see that? You don't see it anywhere. When you look around you, what you see are people falling ill, sick, dying, suffering, in misery. And you can extend that in every way. How can you possibly say that the human being is in the image of God when the evidence of your eyes tells you otherwise, and yet Scripture doesn't lie? So how do you hold that together? And now he gives, from chapter 16 to chapter 28, 29, he gives a whole other account about what is going on with this. And there are two aspects to that other account. He first of all starts off by noting that there's already a discrepancy in the Genesis verb. God created a human being in his image, male and female created he them. But he points out male and female is not in the archetype, the one Lord Jesus Christ, in whom there's neither male nor female. So there's already a departure. So he's going to go back and examine what's going on in that. But before he actually turns to that, he says the main difference of human existence as the image of God and the prototype is that the human being has come into existence out of nothing and is therefore always in motion and always in change. Okay? And it's this changeability that provides the basis for the distinction. He then goes on to say, well, in fact, when God says, when Genesis says, God created a human being in his image, in Gregory's argument, he says, the human being that is created as the image of God is the totality of all human beings from beginning to end. The entire pleroma of humanity in all its particulars constitute the one human being that is in the image of God, which is quite a wild statement. The way that von Balthasar puts it is that the total Adam is the total Christ. The starting point is Adam, the end point is Christ, and it's a totally universalistic picture where the entire pleroma of humanity together constitute the one human being in the image of God. But that therefore means that this is in progress. We're not there yet. The body's still being built up, so you cannot see it whilst it's in progress. So you've now got the economy from the beginning to end in which this is all now being formed, the entire pleroma. He then turns to the question of, so what's male and female got to do with all of this? And intriguingly, he says, I'm not going to tell you what comes to my mind. Instead, I'm going to give you images of the truth as exercises for kindly hearers, kindly readers. So he's not going to tell us what he actually thinks, but he's going to give us exercises. And then for 3 or 4 chapters, he gives all sorts of exercises describing various aspects of all of this. And I think the reason what he's doing in all of that is to challenge us not to think about male and female and sexual reproduction simply in terms of the preservation of the species, or the preservation of the family, or the preservation of the honor, or whatever else, or for people to look after us in old age, or whatever else one might think. To challenge us not to think like that, but rather to understand it in terms of building up the body of Christ. Okay? Having gone through all of that, during which he does talk about, perhaps if we hadn't fallen away from the good, we would have been able to multiply like the angels, who are not sexual, and maybe would have done that. And it's those passages which people have taken at face value and said, Gregory thinks before the fall, we would have multiplied like the angels, no need of male and female, and all the rest of it. But these are all part of his exercises as he's preparing us to come back to the question. And then finally, in chapter 22, he comes back to the question a third time and says, let's go back to the scriptural text. In the image of God, male and female, he created them, male and female created them. Then he blesses them to increase and multiply. And so Gregory points out, well, according to scriptural text, we never had a means of multiplying other than as male and female, because the blessing to multiply comes after male and female. But he's now given us another way of thinking about it. So all sorts of fun things going on from chapter 16 to 22. But with this whole view of the whole economy from beginning to end as building up that body, the body of Christ, which is the entire pleroma of humanity, that together is the human in the image of God. He goes on to talk about other things, about how evil is finite, therefore our movement towards evil will necessarily come to an end, but we are still in movement, so we will return to the good. He talks about what matter is, about what the resurrection might be, all of those kind of things. And then we get to the end chapters, and in the end chapters, which really nobody pays any attention to in this work of Gregory, he then does exactly what Timaeus does in the third part of Timaeus' speech, which is to bring together everything he's done so far, but now bring it together under the rubric of a particular human being and how each of us comes into existence and how we grow in this way. So he points out a seed is deposited in the womb. There it grows by the power of growth and nutrition until it's ready to come out into this world of sense perception. In this world of sense perception, it is growing in intellect, growing in virtue. It's a process of growth that we're in this world as we're moving towards that putting off the old man, putting on the new man. Okay. Which he then ends the work with in other works of his, especially on those who've fallen asleep. He kind of completes the thought where he comments that those people who are saddened at the death of others because they've left this life and all the blessings of this life, he says, they're in fact fetuses and not yet humans. They don't realize that we're still in this womb, this world as a womb in which we are still progressing to finally be born through our death, resurrection, transformation. So this world now becomes the womb in which we continue to grow to the point of our birth from Adam into Christ in the resurrection and its transformation. So that whole scope of the economy from Adam to Christ is replicated or reduplicated or recapitulated or actually echoed in the lifespan of each particular human being, coming into the world, coming into existence in the womb as a seed, deposited, growing in that, then growing in the world, then deposited in the womb of this world to be born again into the life of the resurrection. And actually, the more I read him, and the more I read others like that, it really seems to me that both for him and for Timaeus, for Plato, it really is that last third of the work, that third part of the work, which is really the heart of their work, which is describing what actually is happening with each and every one of us. And the first two parts of the work are meant as theological reflections, which give us a way of understanding what is happening in this concrete lifespan. You know, what the ideal model is, which we're moving towards, the economy on the large scale, from Adam to Christ, the building of the total pleroma of humanity. But that movement is actually the one of each of our own lifespans, coming into existence, growing, dying, rebirth through death. So, if I'm right in that analysis, and it's an if, of course, then Gregory has not only reworked the Philo with his work on the soul and resurrection, but he's also done that with the Timaeus, which shows an incredible, in my opinion, an incredible freedom with regard to expressing Christian theology at the end of the 4th century, latter part of the 4th century, which really no one before or after has matched, reworking these classical forms, filling them with new content, but using the same kind of analysis, but taking it further in that way. Yeah, okay, I'll leave it at that. I'm sure we'll get into all sorts of discussion from that.
That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. It's so illuminating. And I like the idea of our living in the womb of this world and waiting to be reborn. That's very striking. Does he actually use the phrase, the womb of this world?
Maximus does. Maximus does. That's getting it from that. Yeah, Maximus takes it up.
Yes.
So yes. Maximus replays all of this in his Ambiguum 41 and other works like that. But he does talk about people who are still alive in this world and are fearful of death as being fetuses. You're not yet human, you're a fetus.
Yes. Father Andrew, are you ready to come in?
I suppose so. There's so much there that I'm not quite sure quite to come in on. I mean, the first thing that strikes me is a very general point that just as Gregory of Nyssa himself, I mean, I don't think anybody, or very, very few people in his time or the centuries after him, had much idea what he was up to. The exceptions, I think, to me, to be Maximus and Origen.
Yeah.
I mean, both of them pick up what he's doing and see that it's important. And I mean, the kind of the fate of Gregory of Nyssa's impact is really very curious. I mean, he was one of what we now call the Cappadocian Fathers, but in the history of the Christian tradition, Gregory of Nyssa is very, very much a lesser figure. That he's very, very frequently confused with the supposedly more famous Gregory, the theologian Gregory of Nazianzus. And the West scarcely knows him, and the East often mixes him up. And it's an amazing story that in the last century there was this rediscovery, this discovery of Maximus, and the creation for Maximus, inspired by Werner Jaeger, of an edition of Gregory, an edition of Gregory that is well, it's a sort of there's no edition like it really of any of the fathers. I mean, he sort of neglected for a very long time, and then suddenly becomes perhaps the most studied of the 4th century fathers. But even so, there's still the tendency, which is, I think, has got a long history that we perhaps can't go into here, but the fathers tend to be picked apart rather than read as a whole. You know, I think it probably goes back to the way in which in the way in which the fathers were taught. They are taught as the people who produced the definitions that were found in the councils. And it's the councils that give you the history of doctrine, and then the fathers are fitted into it some way. And that's been disentangled a good deal. But in the case of Gregory, there's a huge task. It is we're discovering something sort of completely new. And it's I mean, your suggestion, which I find very convincing, and I think it's similarly the case with On the Soul and the Resurrection, that Gregory of Nyssa is actually reworking in a very free way Platonic texts that he clearly knew very well. Many of the fathers know about Plato, but mostly we think it's a bit exceptional when they seem to know the text and the structure of the argument. They take ideas out of it and use them in their own context. text, but it's not very often that you get anything like this sort of engagement with the text. One wonders how this came about. Has anybody else got any ideas? I think really, rather.
Could it be a reaction to Julian's trying to cut Christians off from classical culture? And so what Gregory and Basil too is trying to do is provide a Christian counterpart, which can't be, well, they've made the classical tradition their own, as it were. So they bypass Julian's aim.
So you've got all the rewriting done by Apollinaris and his father.
Yes, that's right. Yes,
of the Gospels and the Psalms and so on.
Yes.
In different genres, yeah.
Yes.
But that was, yeah. But there's a big difference between reworking the classical tradition and trying to substitute for the classical tradition, which is what Apollinaris and his father are up to. And nobody seems very much interested in it because very little of it survives.
Yes.
But I mean, it certainly comes out of this. There's certainly, yeah. So certainly the importance of the classical tradition is kind of underlying by Julian's trying to take it away from the Christians. At least for some of them, anyway.
Yes, you could say, I suppose, that Gregory is actually doing something much more bold than Apollinaris, in that he's rewriting, as it were, some of the key documents of the classical tradition, philosophical tradition, and putting them in a form that has taken on completely new meaning.
But he's not replacing them. I mean,
not replacing, no. But
to understand what Gregory is doing, you have to understand where it's coming from, and that requires
oh yes, yes,
a very serious knowledge of Plato. There are other people for whom something like this has been suggested. I mean, there's a recent book, I'm not sure I agree with it completely, but Dusenberry, I think, wants to see Nemesius or Nemessa's book on human nature as, in some sense, a reworking of themes from the Republic.
Right.
Wants to see the central idea of for Dusenberry is that that the central idea for Nemesius Messer's book on human nature is the analogy between the human and the city, which is one of the basic ideas in the Republic.
Yeah, so Nemesius picks up a whole load of material from the medical writings on that kind of point. Yeah. But I think one of the more fascinating things, I think, Father Andrew, is something you pointed out, is that we've tended to think of the development of doctrine as being that which is done by the councils, defining particular doctrines, and then reading the fathers to understand those doctrines and to fit it into that shape. So the idea of what Christian theology might look like in the hands of somebody like Gregory, where he's presented it in the structure and the mode of argumentation of the Timaeus. And it looks really dynamic. And it's a way of it's a way of reading scripture as well, which is quite different to the patterns that we would tend to think. So I mentioned, the tendency to interpret Gregory in terms of the creation, prelapsarian existence, postlapsarian existence, and so on. Gregory's not doing that at all. He's
Yeah.
looking at the basic structure of human life, conception, birth, growth, death, and so on, and using the kind of analysis that you get from the Timaeus with a Christian content. What is the telos? What is the goal that's being produced in all of this? How is it coming to be on a large scale? And then how does this help us understand who we are and what our path is in all of this?
Mm.
Very different.
Yeah.
One thing that surprised me in your description of the work is the fact that he deals so briefly with the problem of evil.
Yeah.
Now, this is a period when Manichaeans were really quite a serious threat to Christianity. And so this seems a bit puzzling. Does he deal with the problem elsewhere in detail?
He doesn't seem to be bothered by the threat of Manichaeism, certainly not in this work, nor in the Soul and Resurrection. And I don't recall any other
Catechetical
work he does.
the catechetical narration certainly has got is from time to time occupied by
But he doesn't seem to be overwhelmingly bothered by it or needing to
no, but he had
respond to it.
there.
Yeah.
I think it's part of the the process of catechesis.
Yeah.
Some sort of
And his view that it's a secondary element within creation is very similar to Isaac of Nineveh.
Mm.
And that's an important feature in Isaac's understanding of what's going on.
So, Sebastian, could you say that again? What's the connection you're making?
You said that Gregory stated that evil is a secondary element that's entered into creation.
And therefore necessarily finite.
Yes, exactly. And that's very important for Isaac with his views on
salvation.
Salvation, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it'd be interesting to know if Isaac had read Gregory.
Well, it was translated.
He could have. It's in Syria.
Yeah,
Yes.
the manuscripts were late 6th century, I think.
Yes,
570 or something like that.
It's certainly possible. So one day when someone's published the Syriac at long last, one might be able to discover. Very intriguing. Yes.
The Syriac manuscripts were really helpful for me when preparing this. When I did my edition of Origins on First Principles, I became really interested in the paratextual features of chapter headings and how they help structure the work and what's going on with it.
Yes.
So the edition of On First Principles that we've had from Curtishow and then the translation by Butterworth is off with regard to the way it divides the work up. So when I did my edition of Origen, I looked at his comments about where he says things like, I've done this, now let's do that. And then worked out like that.
Yes.
Because almost certainly none of the chapter headings in Origen go back to himself. That's too early. The idea of chapter divisions and so on really kind of starts a little bit later than that. With Gregory, he prefaces the whole work with a letter to his brother. And at the end of that letter, he does have a list of topics, which are not chapter headings. Some of them are questions. Some of them say things in the heading which are contradicted by what he actually does within the text. He's forcing you to think about how the heading goes and what he's actually doing with it. So for instance, what comes to be chapter 18, the heading is that the passions take their rise from the body. Actually, in chapter 18, he says, no, the motions take their rise from the body, but it's the evil husbandry of the mind that turns the motions into passions. So there's a kind of a disjunction between them,
Yes, very nice.
But the Syriac manuscripts, at least the one I was looking at, the Vatican Museum Library, half a dozen or a dozen of those headings had made their way into the manuscript as chapter headings. but not all of them. So it seemed to me to suggested it represented a stage in the manuscript tradition where the scribes had begun to reposition these thematic topics as chapter divisions.
Yes.
So you could actually see the evolution of the way that the text was being read and transcribed because of the Syriac manuscripts.
Yes, it's very important to remember that all these text divisions are secondary or even tertiary or much more.
Yeah.
And it does make a difference to the
Very
way one
much
reads texts.
Very much so.
It's something far too easy to forget. And having printed editions makes it even more so difficult to
and the great influence an editor and translator can have by putting in headings at certain places.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
I should have also noted, but I forgot in the beginning, that I've called the work On the Human Image of God. It was previously translated as On the Making of Man, De Hominis Opificio, which is in the colophon in several of the manuscripts, but the earliest references to it are as peri ikonos, which is how, as Andrew mentioned, Origen, who translated the work, translated as De Imagine.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's
intriguing. I put on the peri ikonos anthropo was a Greek title.
Yes.
I had to put On the Human Image of God. I had to put the word of God in it to make sense in English.
Yes.
But
how do you think sorry.
I was going to say, even understanding the heading or the title of the work gives a very different sense of what you expect to find in it. Yeah. So it's not On the Making of Man as in a detailed exposition of Genesis 1, Genesis 2, and as one might expect, but it's on how the human being is in the image and why we don't see it yet. And then how we understand ourselves within this overarching economy, which is only completed at the end.
Yes. Is it possible to say when De Opificio became the title? And maybe it was
it's with the printed editions.
So very late.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Do you think it was seeing the work as a continuation of Basil's Hexaemeron?
Yeah. Together with a much more historicizing approach to reading Genesis.
Yes.
Rather than a theological approach in understanding who we are.
Yes.
That kind of change.
Yes.
And then you get into prelapsarian, post-lapsarian, and all those kind of categories, which don't help.
Yes.
One thing, though, worth just a question. A great deal of Gregory's work is related very closely to his brother. He seems to his brother died early.
Yeah.
He seems to have seen it as his initial task to complete and defend his brother's reputation. So he completes a further response, in fact, two further responses to the attacks with the Eunomian controversy. His little book on the Hexaemeron is in relation to Basil's book. There are these curious homilies that survive, which are attributed sometimes to Basil, sometimes to Gregory, and it's not at all clear where they stand. But they seem to be providing a completion of the Hexaemeron, which doesn't get up to the creation of man. And Basil probably died. And then, I mean, this piece, it starts off by he's making a good deal of the fact that what he's doing is in relation to what Basil, our common father and teacher, had done.
Yeah, and let's suggest to Peter, their brother. That's and it's a Paschal gift for him. Yeah,
yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, is this just basically irrelevant, or is there something important about what Basil sees his role as in relation to what his brother had done?
I honestly think that Gregory, although he's presenting it as completing that which Basil didn't finish,
Mm.
he is doing a lot more than that.
Of course, yeah.
Obviously a lot more. And so it's done in a very different key. So he's in effect rewriting Basil as well.
Mm.
Yeah. So it's not simply a continuation, but it's a rewriting. I'm not sure what the relationship is between the dating of on the human image and the dating of his own apology for the hexameron, or simply the hexameron is, because he also does that and reworks that hexameron.
Oh, yeah.
Perhaps at this point we could invite other listeners, readers, into the conversation. So please join with comments, questions, or whatever. John, one of the things that struck me, you said Gregory really wasn't read later or understood except by Maximus. I think it's the fate of many of these early Christian writers that in the 6th century, people started making these catenae and doxological collections, theological collections of just excerpts. So the temptation was just to go to the short form and learn your theology that way. And there wasn't much instigation to read the whole text. And this attitude is actually very clear in History of Syriac treatment of Ephraim. We only have complete poems by Ephraim in 6th century manuscripts. Everything after that, you have excerpts, rewritings, and taking verses from one poem, joining them with another, so you produce something totally different, or just inserting them into much later poems. So what you read of Ephraim, and it's all attributed to Ephraim in the Fenketha, the Festal Hymnary, is actually hardly anything is really genuine. And certainly you don't get any impression of what Ephraim was really saying. So I suppose Gregory hasn't suffered quite as badly as that.
No, but you point to a fascinating point there about the development of the catenae, excerpts from these different writers and so on, and the way that changes the reading of the tradition. And then part also would be the increasing fixity of the way one thinks about the shape of Christian theology. So something I learned from reading Quinton Skinner and the idea of the mythology of doctrines, that we think a discipline is constituted by particular doctrines. Of course, Christian theology is constituted by Trinity, Incarnation, Ecclesiology, Mariology, and all these different things. But Ignatius of Antioch wouldn't have thought so. He wasn't thinking he's got to do that. And I think in the 4th century, it's a really creative period before it starts to get fixed into what particular categories that then are complemented by catena, where you have catena on particular topics. So there's a changing shape like that, and maybe the 4th century was just an absolute unique period in to Christianity, where you had the freedom with all of that. Not yet to think in fixed forms and so on.
Yes.
But I
see there's a question from Miri Rubin. So please, Miri.
He's absolutely relevant for Christians to understand their own tradition and to open up their minds for thinking about how their own tradition can be thought. Okay, which then I do think that it's really only by studying, especially ancient writers like him, that we go beyond our own presumed horizons and have our own presuppositions challenged, to learn how to see things differently so that we're able to express it ourselves today. So on the one hand, it gives us resources for learning about our tradition, the Christian tradition, in different ways so that we can think and speak with others today. Then the other level I would would want to address it would be, he gives us a way of looking at what it is to be human, which is totally grounded in the natural lifespan of each human being, whether Christian or not. It's a we're all conceived in the womb, we all grow in the womb, we all come out into this world, we all learn to grow, we learn to walk, we learn to talk, we learn to reason, hopefully we learn to practice virtue. So there's a commonality of what it is to be human. So he's putting those two things together, which actually I think does make for a really rich interfaith dialogue.
I fear we must draw to a conclusion. Thank you enormously, Father John and Father Andrew. It's been a really fascinating episode, as it were. Thank you.
Thank you.
I look forward to reading your book and reading Gregory's text, which I never read. I've read excerpts, I suppose, but not the whole thing. But I should certainly read part 3.
You use the catena.
Well, I'm afraid that's probably what I did use. The next meeting is on the 11th of September, Acho Shemun Kashu, on a 9th century Syriac author, Ioannis of Dara, on the resurrection of bodies. So this actually follows on very well with what Father John's been talking about, and Gregory. So until then, all the best.
Thank you, everybody.
You.